This is iCastNews.com, live and direct from United Nations headquarters in New York City. And this is Heat in the Middle East. Joining me today is George Baumgarden. George represents Kenya's wonderful Nation Media Group here at the United Nations. He's a veteran correspondent. George, Happy New Year.
Thank you, and same to you.
2013, heat in the Middle East in a lot of ways. Coming up, the next incident we know about that may change international politics or may not, an Israeli election. What do you see coming up in the Israeli election and how it's going to affect international relations?
Well, outwardly, unless something changes, if the polls are to be believed, the right-wing Likud party of Prime Minister Netanyahu supposedly will be reelected for another term. I think the terms are 5 years, somewhat similar to the, but in most ways very, very different to the British parliamentary system.
Very different.
The basic problem with the Israeli system, a basic difference is it has what I consider to be two inherent faults. Number one, as an American, I have an inherent distrust of unicameral legislatures.
We only have one in the United States.
We only have one in the United States, which is the state legislature of Nebraska and Lincoln. Every one of the other 49 state legislatures and our national legislature, the U.S. Congress, are bicameral legislatures, with each house, the upper and lower house, acting in some fashion as a check on the other. The second problem is the Knesset, which consists of 120 seats, is elected by what's called proportional representation. That is,
same thing as the German Bundestag, as I understand.
I'm not that familiar with the Bundestag in Berlin, but I do know what proportional representation means. It means essentially if you have a single house of 120 seats and you were to get theoretically exactly 10% of the vote, you get 12 seats. This is not deeply abstruse politics, it's third or fourth grade math.
So you don't have just Democrats and Republicans, you have a whole rainbow coalition of different parties and various, as we say in Hebrew, meshuganas.
Yes.
That means crazy people.
The way the system has developed over the last 63 years, since or 64 years now, since the first Knesset in 1949, it has tended to favor fringe parties. Therefore, since you have, again, back to the third or fourth grade math, you have 120 seats, whomever gets 61 seats, practically speaking about 65, 66, in order to govern with some efficiency, forms a government. No one party has ever gotten 61 seats. I don't think any party has gotten much more than about 40 seats, and that was a long time ago. I don't think there was any party that has recently gotten more than about 25, 30 seats. So you have two major parties, Likud and Avodah, Labor Party. Avodah means work or labor in Israel. And you have the somewhat centrist party, which is called Kadima, which means forward in Hebrew. Likud is headed by Netanyahu. The Avodah, the Labor Party, is headed by a woman named Shali Nachimovich.
Mm-hmm.
And the centrist Kadima Party is headed by Tzipi Livni, the former foreign minister.
Also foreign spy, if I remember correctly.
I don't recall that detail, but although I met her a couple of times, I'm sure that I vaguely recall something about this. So, for example, if a party gets 35 seats, they need to put together a minimum of 26, more likely about 30 seats from various other parties.
So who's going to be the party that's going to partner up or party up with Mr. Netanyahu?
Well, traditionally, the party or group of parties that have supported every government either Labor or Likud. And each of these parties had an original name which they no longer use. Labor was originally called Mapai, which was an acronym for Workers' Party of the Land of Israel, Miflegat Poalei Eretz Yisrael, and Likud was originally called Cherut, which means independence or liberty. It was founded by the man who became prime minister for half a dozen years in the late 70s, 1977, Menachem Begin.
Remember him? He was a former terrorist, right? It threw bombs at the British and stuff like that. Came out of Russia as a believer in.
He came actually out of Belarus.
Yeah, which was part of Russia.
Which was then part of Russia. I don't know if I would call him a terrorist. There is a difference. Begin most famously bombed the
King David Hotel, yeah.
Or rather, more specifically, that wing, the south wing of the King David Hotel, which formed the British headquarters. Now, unlike terrorists who don't give any warning, they gave a warning to the hotel. Of course, what they did was, and there's a wonderful book about this, whose author's name I forget, which is called By Blood and Fire, coming from the Hebrew quote, I think Talmudic quotation, Bidam va'esh, by blood and fire. By blood and fire, Judea fell, and by blood and fire, Judea, the Jewish state, will be reborn. They sent one of the bombers over to the local candy store, who picked up then, this is 1946, you understand, July 22nd, 46, and picked up the local party line phone in the candy store, called the King David switchboard, and said, "This is the Irgun, the National Army Organization, Irgun Tzvai Leumi, headed by Begin. This is the Irgun. We have just placed bombs in the King David Hotel. You'd better get your people out of there." And unfortunately, I guess this changed the way bomb threats are handled by potential targets ever since. A low-level telephone operator just decided it was a crank call to be ignored. Of course, about 3 or 4 or 5 minutes later, she found out. I don't know if she survived, but she found out.
Not a crank call.
It was not a crank call. The whole south wing of the hotel collapsed.
I'm sorry, I diverted you from the question.
At any rate, the Cherut party, now known as Likud, is now headed, founded by Begin, is now headed by Benjamin Netanyahu, commonly known as Bibi. We are told, if the polls are to be believed, that he or his Likud / Yisrael Beitenu, Israel Our Home, which is the farther right party of the foreign minister, Victor Lieberman.
Who's now not running for a seat himself, right? He got pushed out because he's allegations of corruption.
He has decided to decline to be part of the list of candidates for Yisrael Beitenu. It is not clear. It may have been chosen. Someone may have been chosen, but it is not clear who the head person on the list for Yisrael Beitenu / Likud.
Is this a good thing for Israel that he's not running again? In your humble opinion?
Theoretically, but the ultimate answer to that question lies in the identity of the person chosen to supersede him, to succeed him, rather.
Well, I understand that Mr. Lieberman, inside the ruling circles in Israel, has been the most hawkish for bombing Iran right away.
I don't know that specifically. His most famous core position has been the basic concept of loyalty oaths. That is, any citizen, whether Jewish or Arab, who takes a loyalty oath to the state of Israel will be allowed to remain. Any Arabs, although they may have lived in Israel, who declined to take such an oath, have got to leave.
Maybe
this
we
has
need to
become
send.
Very controversial.
Maybe we need to send him one of the books about McCarthyism and loyalty oaths. They did really good things here in America.
I don't know if I would necessarily agree with that. I just vaguely remember the tail end of the McCarthy era, although I had it pointed out to me once on a train on the way to Washington, and I won't even tell you how long ago. You would think it's something terrible. On the other hand, every person who gets a first passport in the United States is called to just routinely and perfunctorily raise your right hand. Do you swear allegiance to the United States? Well, I did that when I was 16 many, many years ago when I got my first passport. If you put it in that context, it doesn't sound quite severe. And I've met Lieberman a couple of times. I personally heard him describe it. It doesn't sound as radical as some of his opponents would have characterized it. Be that as it may, he is a somewhat more right-wing adherent of what has now become the Likud / Yisrael Beitenu, Israel Our Home coalition, or maybe some would say collision. And again, the ultimate answer would be in the identity of the person chosen to succeed him as part of that coalition.
So let me see if I got
party
this.
Within the coalition.
Right. You think that Mr. Netanyahu is going to win re-election, and the question is, who does he then partner with?
Well, he already partners with Israel Beitenu. They have made an agreement for electoral campaign purposes that they are running together. So if I understand the situation, I'm not an Israeli citizen, I can't vote, I haven't seen a sample ballot. The head of the ballot will say Likud / Israel Beitenu, Likud and the Israel Our Home party.
So do you think that once this election is over, we'll see a diminution of the agitation to do something about Iran, or will it get ramped up?
The answer is I don't know. I think that will be driven less by rhetoric from within the Knesset than it will be by events from outside Israel.
You know, as an interviewer, I love it when people say they don't know, because you know what? I think that's honest, and I think we don't know what's going to be going on.
Well, nobody knows for sure, but the place to watch is the city to watch in that is not Yerushalayim, Jerusalem. It's Tehran.
Where should we watch?
Tehran. Watch what goes on in Iran, in the Iranian government. The most important thing you have to know about the way the Iranian government and the Iranian leadership works is Mr. Ahmadinejad, as extreme as he is not your conventional tyrant. A conventional tyrant is a person with absolute power. He does not have absolute power.
And his power is diminishing all the time.
His power is diminishing simply by the fact that he's a lame duck, that the Constitution says he cannot run for a third 5-year term, and he has chosen not to challenge that. That would be the act of a conventional tyrant.
So George...
On the other hand, let me just finish this characterization, if I may. When you analyze the political system, political scientists first ask the question of who really governs, who is really sovereign. The answer for Iran is there are 3 loci of sovereignty. One is the president and his adherents and the party or parties around him. That's not political parties. It's groups of people around him. The second, of course, is the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. And the third is the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, the IRGC, Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps. So you have to look and see what positions, if any, are being expressed by each of those 3 components of the ruling governing class within Iran.
George, thank you very much. You heard it here first. If you want to see reaction to what the outcome of the Israeli election is, we're not going to look towards Israel. We're not going to look to Tehran. We're going to look deep into Tehran, to the 3 groups that George just mentioned. He's given us context and perspective, ways of understanding the heat in the Middle East that's coming out of one of the few countries in the Middle East that has that rarest of things, a democratic government. George, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan, for having me.
For ICASTnews.com, live and direct from the United Nations in New York City for Heat in the Middle East, I'm Jonathan Sanders.